Okay, today we're going to be taking a look at two of the best male triathletes in the world and their run forms. Yep, we're going to be taking a look at none other than Jan Frodeno and Gustav Iden. We're going to be using actual race footage where they're running at pace during the PTO's Collins Cup in Slovakia earlier this year. They both had the fastest run splits of the day, just 30 seconds separating them. But what similarities or differences do they have when it comes to their run technique or form? Well, I'm going to be speeding it up, slowing it down, placing them side by side for all of us to see. Well, I think it's fair to say that both Jan and Gustav have lovely run forms and techniques. In fact, I'd probably go as far as saying they're quite mesmerising to watch. But they do look a little bit different, and I think it's probably worth stating, yes, they do have slightly different builds and shapes. Jan is 6'4" or 194 centimetres and roughly 75 kilograms. Although he is so lean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's less than that. Gustav is 5'10" or 177 centimetres and roughly 66 kilograms. Now, this means we might expect to see slightly different leg cadences and so on because of that. However, both have performed very well over short course racing in triathlon and also long course racing. Jan was or is the 2008 Beijing Olympic triathlon champion, as well as having numerous other ITU World Triathlon Series podiums. Gustav was 8th at the 2020 Tokyo Olympic Games and also other World Triathlon podiums. And now both have seamlessly transitioned to long course racing. Jan is 3-time Ironman World Championship winner and 2-time Ironman 70.3 World Championship winner, and also iron distance world record holder. Maybe that's a debate for another day. Anyway, Gustav is now 2-time Ironman 70.3 World Championship winner and has stepped up to full distance quite recently with a bang. And it also seems like he hasn't quite let go of the short distance dream either, as he focuses on another Olympic cycle. But now let's get down to the run analysis. Both athletes have topped the PTO World Rankings for 2021, with Gustav in first and Jan in second. But how do their run forms compare? So let's dive into this. Sadly, I don't have much side-on running footage of them, which would have obviously been lovely, but I've got some superb front-on footage, which I'm going to do my best with. So let's start by taking a look at the overall component that makes up speed, which is stride frequency and stride length. So side by side, you can see straight off that Gustav has a slightly faster cadence or stride frequency than Jan. In fact, I was going to hazard a guess that Gustav's around the 180 steps per minute, and that's what I kind of worked for my calculations, but I have gone further. I've stalked Gustav on his Strava and looking at that file from the Collins Cup, and it actually says 181, so I was pretty close there. Whilst Jan is around the 160 to 170. I'm probably going to say high 160 to 170s. Quite hard to work it out exactly. Obviously, this is counting as best as possible the footage we have, but I don't think that's hugely surprising given the difference of the two in terms of the body builds that we were talking about before. Jan has much longer legs and limbs, which is going to make, well, is why we see him with that longer stride, and at times it can look quite loping, but we'll get into all of that a little bit later on. In terms of step length, Gustav is covering, I've done a bit of calculation here, 1.77 meters, making it a 3.5 meter stride length if we were counting 2 steps per stride. Whereas for Jan, we're looking at roughly a step length of 1.87 meters and a stride length of 3.73 meters. So covering at least 23 centimeters more per stride, but crucially, still traveling at pretty similar speeds. As I said, I've done my best with the calculations there from the footage I have, so don't take that as gospel, but it's in pretty much the right ballpark. One thing to note though, when we are ever looking at elite runners, we quite often hear cadences of 180 steps per minute and so on, and people talk about that as that is the go-to cadence you should have. Before you suddenly start changing your own cadence in line with that, pause, don't do that quite yet, because that can actually increase your metabolic cost to run, i.e. you are using more energy to run because you're simply not used to that cadence if you're trying to increase it quite drastically. So just do it step by step, gradually increase it by around 5 to 10% until you're comfortable, and then go from there. Now let's take a look at some of the specific aspects of the run form, starting with the foot strike. So as you can see here, both have very similar midfoot strike, as well as their feet striking relatively close to their center of mass. And again, I wish I had side angle here to observe it better, but having watched them racing in the flesh, I can confirm this. This basically allows them to carry their momentum forwards efficiently without essentially a braking force outstretched in front of them. In terms of vertical oscillation, basically how much they bounce, move up and down when they run, and I mean, there is very little in this one. At a glance, it does seem like Jan's is much more, but I think that's partly due to his taller physique, his longer limbs. In reality, there's not really that much in it at all, but Jan does have more bounce than Gustav. Interestingly, Gustav does glide along quite well. Typically, bounce isn't something that we strive for, as it can increase the stress that we experience through our joints, but inevitably does come in some cases with running faster. Particularly for triathletes, we're running fatigued coming off the bike, so you tend to see less bounce than you do for pure fresh runners. Now taking a look at the peak hip flexion and peak hip extension. Again, could really do with a side-on shot for this, but essentially at higher speeds, we tend to see a higher peak hip flexion, which is basically how high you lift and drive the knee up. And then the extension, which is the leg fully extended out back with the nice toe off. Again, tend to see a higher angle in the hip extension at faster speeds. That extension allows for a slight stretch in the hip flexors, which causes a similar effect to, I guess, an elastic band, which means it helps to bring the leg forwards during the swing phase. From what we can see, they do look quite similar here, but what does look different is the way in which their legs track. Now Jan's feet and knees track in a very linear fashion. You can see his knees land in line with his feet directly underneath his hips, whereas Gustav almost has a slight outward curve of the leg. Not necessarily a bowed leg shape, but the knees definitely point outward in comparison. Perhaps this is just simply strong use of the glutes, pulling them out, but it does, I've got to say, have a slight Lionel Sanders touch to it. And with that, almost like he bounces from one leg more so than Jan does. To be clear, again, that's perfectly normal to do that as you naturally shift your weight from one foot to the other, to a degree, obviously. Now that, I've got to say, is probably the biggest difference between their run forms. Does that affect their arm carriage at all though? Well, Jan does seem to have quite tense and high shoulders, which I've got to say, isn't his usual look for him. I'm wondering whether he was just quite tense coming off the bike. They did experience some rain towards the end of the bike, and maybe he was just cold and as a result was left feeling quite tense and shrugging his shoulders up. But Gustav does have very low and relaxed shoulders. Despite that, they both have a relatively similar arm swing. They drive their elbows back. That aids in counteracting angular momentum from the legs. But to do that, you have to have good mobility, obviously, to be able to maintain that arm swing. Front on though, you can see that the way that they carry those hands up and forwards, it comes up towards almost the top of their sternums, both symmetrical and keeping their arms quite close to their bodies. And it's pretty much identical for the two of them. But yeah, you can, again, it does seem for Jan's movements, maybe it seems a little bit more accentuated, but it's probably simply due to his height and longer limbs. And finally, both have a good neutral head position. Very little to zero movement in addition to just generally shifting of weight and movement with that. They both look very composed and incredibly rhythmic. It's actually, I've got to say, as I said at the start, very mesmerizing to watch them both running. Well, guys, I love this kind of comparison. Both obviously churning out amazing performances and sometimes that are very similar to one another. Take Collins Cup, for example. I mean, literally 30 seconds separating them. However, they do look quite different, as we saw today. When you dive down into it though, the fundamentals of their form and their technique are being executed almost identically. So really quite interesting. I hope you guys out there have enjoyed today's video. If you would like to see any other comparisons between any other athletes, or you'd like me to dive more into this, or you have anything to add to my comparison today, then please drop them in the comments section down below. If you've enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe down below too.